There are a lot of great sci-fi movies, shows, and stories out there. Some beautiful works of art that are killed by corporate greed or a lack of faith in the artists. Some ringed out to the end of time, not for its narrative, but for its commoditive potential. But once in a while, when the right people have faith in the right creative minds, when the people who have a passion for their craft and what they're doing come together, when love is poured into a story that stretches the span of time, well then you get a series worth watching. It's still one of the best sci-fi series that truly does get storytelling right. And that is, of course, Foundation. Hello fellow Mudbeards, Foundation fans, and anyone who wonders why someone would think so highly of the series Foundation. Today I'm going to be going over some of my favorite aspects of the story, from the visuals and aesthetics all the way up to the characters and plot potential. But a key thing to note, by the time I get to the plot potential segment, I will be touching on some book spoilers, and theorizing about the future of the series with the context we've been given so far. But for the most part, I'll simply be breaking down why Foundation is such a great example of sci-fi storytelling. See, when you really think about it, there are two types of ways to make a sci-fi story. You can have a relatively realistic world revolve around one specific sci-fi element, something along the lines of series like Severance, Dark, The OA. Then you have stories revolving around a world or universe that was built by sci-fi concepts. By this I would mean The Expanse, Blade Runner, or even Star Wars. I would say Foundation's story falls more into the latter, with the unique distinction of introducing some of these concepts before any series like Star Wars or even Dune, with the source material by Asimov being sort of the grandfather of most sci-fi inspirations. Now you might be thinking, the show doesn't follow the source material to a T, and are you really comparing it to a show like The Expanse? That might be pushing it. But there's no way a sci-fi series like Foundation is ever gonna beat a show like Andor. And for that, I'd argue in a lot of cases you'd be right. For most of what's presented, Andor is almost a perfect example of sci-fi storytelling. Its only real caveat being the actual franchise it's attached to. I mean, you see all the sacrifices and all the great character development we get throughout the story, and where does it all lead? Well, basically down the line, Empire 2.0 comes around. Had it been segmented as its own thing, or branched off as its own individual story, there'd be something different to say. But in the grand scheme of things, unfortunately, you really have to enjoy it in isolation, and forget about the later consequences of the story that render these actions sort of redundant. It is still crazy that people would fall for such a tyrannical leader in such a short amount of time. Either way, let's go ahead and start off my appreciation for Foundation specifically by highlighting its visuals. One of the beautiful things about sci-fi is you have the freedom to pursue any sort of creative aesthetic you want, which can sometimes be harder than you originally think because often people get caught up in the actual sci-fi concepts rather than the artistic flair. And while there is a certain appreciation for the realism and thought put into certain concepts that could actually take place in our very own future, I do think you need a combination of several different elements to really highlight how interesting these aspects actually are. For example, in some cases, aesthetic simplicity totally works. I'd say the perfect example of this would be a series like The Expanse, where you see some of the main ships that these different factions of humans have, and they're not too different from each other in the grand scheme of things. However, that only highlights its more extraterrestrial aspects of the series in its organisms and structures. See, the aesthetic just makes sense because you're following humanity in a very specific point in time. Then you have a series like Star Wars, where different characters have very individually themed ships that belong to them. But in my opinion, no series really handles its aesthetic flair like Foundation. You can blame it on its Apple connection, blame it on its budget, but at the end of the day, there's still obviously some very creative and passionate minds going into the artistic process behind the scenes. And until we get a potential Warhammer series, I think this is top of the leaderboard in regards to visuals. From the many beautiful space shots to the eye candy that are the planet's surfaces, to the different environments that make it easy to transition between different scenes. From the small attention to detail and upgrades to things like the Whisper ships or even the Imperial Palace itself, they follow a similar mindset to other sci-fi where they mostly show and don't tell. A lot of these ships and vessels you see flying around do have their own names, but don't really get it shoved in your face a whole lot, leaving you to dig and really appreciate the craft by yourself. Never really dwelling too much on a sci-fi ship unless its plot is very essential to the actual series like the Invictus. But the aesthetics even expand to the individuals. Different characters wearing different shades of clothing or representing different types of fabric help individuate different sections of the galaxy and help us see who's representing what faction. Whether it's a barbarian clan that the Empire had forgotten in their rugged clothes, or the colorful wardrobe of a powerful faction like Cloud Dominion. But it's not just for the audience to be able to distinguish them, as there's many moments within the series where other characters are able to tell each other apart based on what they're repping. Now let's cut to the music. The music, I believe, is absolutely fantastic and helps solidify the main emotions the show is trying to convey. That of a grand mystery that can be dark, but at the end is inspirational and follows hope. Produced by Bear McCreary, who's well known for things like God of War's soundtrack and Rings of Power, it helps set the tone, which can be very hard to do for a story. It's also very utilized well throughout the series. But music isn't just something the show uses as flavor on top of a cake, as the characters within the story also rely on it in a way. See, beings known as Mentalics, people with Jedi-like abilities, are capable to be more powerful if utilizing harmony. Whether that be a group of Mentalics playing an instrument together, or a single very powerful Mentalic using an instrument, the show itself does incorporate these elements to its story. But I'm sure the music isn't the main reason that draws people to the show. The main reason would probably be that of the Galactic Empire. But let's go ahead and get into more of the Galactic Empire. Any fan of the series will probably tell you one of their favorite aspects of the story is watching the Genetic Dynasty storyline. The Genetic Dynasty is a series of clones of this very first guy named Cleon. And one of the key elements of this story is watching these clones and their robot handmaid Demrazel try to keep control of a dwindling empire. We see different aspects of the empire falling that, while in the first season are just sort of brushed off and talked about in the background, by the third season become a very in-your-face situation, with all sorts of environmental and aesthetic elements also showcasing the empire's dwindling. You could check out some other videos on the channel to see exactly how that's showcased, but the main way it's presented is through its characters. Despite being clones of the very same guy, each iteration of these characters is very different from each other and very much their own person, with their own set of challenges they're set to overcome. You'd think ruling over a galactic empire would be something to keep in the background of a story, as actually focusing on its downfall would be a hard element to convey. Which is why other stories that involve empires keep the rulers at a visual distance. Having a show tackle the rulers and their day-to-day lives so directly is honestly what reminds me so much of Game of Thrones. The political intrigue, the betrayals, the way ego and power can devolve the mind and turn you into someone who makes decisions anyone with empathy never would. It's because of all these reasons, I'd argue the Foundation's Galactic Empire is the best example of a galactic empire we've seen on screen yet. And interestingly enough, it's not even a big part of the books. See, the Empire falls apart pretty early on within the story. And while there are remnants that stick around and potentials for another equally powerful empire to take its place, at the end of the day, what we're getting in this series is just a little bit different. And sure, having some amazingly talented actors with some very charismatic performances can really help elevate this aspect. It's the way it utilizes its lore, it's the way it sets up its character arcs, and it's the way it continues to tie itself to the rest of the story. A story that never necessarily required it to begin with. But the Empire storyline isn't the only storyline or group of characters that deserve love, as the rest of the characters in the series do have a lot of thought and attention put into them. Whether they were your favorite aspect or not, I completely understand. When I first watched the series, Salvor's storyline was honestly my least favorite. But upon rewatching it, I realized there was no real problem with Salvor's character or anything that was going on with her storyline, and she actually is a pretty respectable individual. I think it's just hard to appreciate these other storylines and characters compared to the Empire. But there is a lot to appreciate. Like with Gale Dornick, arguably the main protagonist of the story and the audience surrogate. And with arguably the Kickstarter of the entire series, Harry Seldon. He who warned humanity that if they don't follow this one simple trick, they are doomed to enter the dark years. That one simple trick being liking and subscribing to MudLuvMedia. And then there's the mysterious deities that seem to be ruling things in the backgrounds. Unlike shows that are more fantasy-based and having gods with no known origin, in this show, you have the previous history of the Robot Wars, seemingly referenced a few times within the show, but also referenced within the Asimov book series. With enough narrative context given, we can believe that these robots, like Demerzel and potentially like the character of Calais, are sort of like this series' gods or force, helping guide humanity in different directions. But let's talk about some of those directions in the overarching plot of the story. And now I'll be getting into some more spoilers for the series itself and potentially a little bit of the books. See, in a lot of sci-fi narratives, you don't really have the backup of time on your side. Sure, a hero can go and take down a big bad evil guy, but unless it's very obvious by the end of the story, odds are another big bad evil guy will rise up to take its place. This especially makes some of the actions of the minor folk they give so much attention to seem a little bit redundant in the grand scheme of things. And it's also why, if you're ever going to make an addition to a story as grand as Star Wars Foundation or anything that widespreading, you really have to pay attention to its potential and where it's already been. But let's talk about potential for a second. In Star Wars, the potential of the Skywalkers is essentially useless because while they were introduced as some mythical, very vital element of the galaxy's prospering, again, in the grand scheme of things, their family was sort of a joke, and likely to just be a blip in this grand scheme of the universe. Had an equal amount of love and passion gone into it that those have for the series, then maybe things would have been different. But again, I think that was more focused on toy sales rather than actually fulfilling a satisfying narrative. No, unlike that, series that do focus on time, like Dark, Three Body Problem, or Foundation, do get to utilize it to the best of their extent. And while it may not start as far back as Three Body Problem storylines, or be as convoluted as the timeline for Dark, it does know where it's trying to go and fill in those gaps the best and most creative way that it can. Having a goal in mind with certain sections of the story plotted out, which David Goyer and his team already established, helps truly focus on how best get these characters to where they're trying to go. And where Foundation's potential is actually going is likely to be dealing with the Mule and finding the second Foundation. Presumably at this point in time of making this video, the second Foundation is on Ignis, but potentially it will become a bigger mystery as the show goes on. No, eventually once the conflict with the Mule begins to reside, the new goal should be finding the planet of Gaia. Without going too deep into detail, it's essentially a giant hive mind world. And then from this point, we should be starting our journey to find Earth, Demrazel's homeworld, and potentially where everything will be revealed about the story and the final crisis humanity will have to face. And while all that is mostly going off the book knowledge, I believe that the actual Foundation series has alluded to heading this direction. See, when Old Man Selden is talking with Gale for one of the last times, he discusses the Invictus again, a ship that was introduced in the very first season of the show. One of its biggest mysterious elements were how the crew died and how far outside the galaxy they actually ended up jumping. Old Man Harry predicts that the Invictus and its destination is towards the 8th crisis and will be the final test that humanity has to endure. I believe this, like the books, is alluding to a big extraterrestrial threat, or simply an external threat of some kind. And while we are likely to see more political problems like those losing faith in the Second Foundation, and the return of spacers and their involvement with the story, maybe even seeing some spacer homeworlds, we could still rely on the fact that all of this is because of each and every one of the characters' decisions. And sure, just like with a series like Star Wars, you can blame it on some grand mystical entity like the Force, or in this case it would be robots/Calais. Either way, the actions taking place have a tether to the consequences we see on screen. And even if a character is killed off early or has no lineage to continue, you can still see how those actions did permanently affect the grand story. And in the grand story, I don't think things will be as predictable as we think. While we can assume it will end with the good guys winning over the bad guys, that's almost with any story as a given. No, with stories like these, usually you have the bad guys lose, but it's everything and all the sacrifices leading up to this point that really make the story hit hard. See, take the Imperial storyline for example. We can assume, eventually, the Empire is going to fall, but I don't think anyone could have predicted the sequences and events that happened so far. And while that's obvious for book readers, there's even elements from the books that don't go exactly as planned, like what happened with Terminus. And while these didn't derail the story in any way, shape, or form, I do think it keeps you on your toes when you're trying to figure out where we're actually going. And with a story where every season takes place roughly 200 years between each other and a new cast of characters with every season, with maybe one or two sticking around between seasons, you really do have a lot of potential to keep the stakes as high as possible. Either way, one of my favorite elements in storytelling is when you never really know if a character is going to make it, you never really know if their actions will have any severe consequences, and you get to see an emperor absolutely lose his power. With the wonderful additions of some amazing music, visuals, and world building, and sci-fi concepts that, while some are inspired from what we've seen today, are mostly the origin for most of what we've seen in the first place. I think there's an argument to be made that the Foundation is sci-fi storytelling done right. And hopefully it will continue to do so. I appreciate you guys watching the video this far. Turns out David Goyer and his team potentially won't be a part of the series going into season 4, but I don't know how rock solid that information actually is. Either way, I'm interested to where the rest of the series goes, and hopefully it gets to push on past season 3. And if you're wondering why I kind of put Star Wars down so much throughout the video, it's because it was originally scripted as a Foundation versus Star Wars segment, but in the end I decided I shouldn't put down someone else's potential passion project just because I personally really like Foundation. I think there's a lot of solid reasons to enjoy both, no matter where the grand narrative actually goes. At the end of the day, it is subjective. But these are my reasons why I think Foundation kind of takes the cake when it comes to sci-fi series. However, that's not to say I'm blind. I understand why anyone would enjoy series like The Expanse or especially Andor. Those are very concise and well thought out series. But in today's age, stories like Scavenger's Reign, Raised by Wolves, or 1899 get cancelled without much faith being put into the creatives. So I just felt like highlighting how great Foundation was because these creatives are putting a lot of passion and love into this project. And I've kind of been standing by the series since season 1. People were kind of bashing on it from the very beginning, and I genuinely really didn't enjoy some of the reasons I was hearing at the time. Most of it involving either race, gender, or the deviation from the source material. And while you're entitled to enjoy those series for whatever reason you like, I don't really think spreading hate is gonna make those series stand out anymore. And Foundation Season 3 has proved that. Over time, you have a lot less people with trivial criticisms and more people with constructive ones. And again, the series ain't perfect, but I do think it deserves its flowers once in a while, and this is my way of doing that. Either way, this is more of a thank you for all the support I've gotten on my Foundation videos. Hopefully you guys enjoy Season 3. Hopefully this can convince 1 or 2 people to give Foundation a try. And if you happen to give it a try and enjoy it, let me know down below in the comments. Either way, thank you guys so much for watching. Thank you much for your feedback and support. And remember, Foundation's one of a kind.